Good evening. There may have been some respite from the heavy rain and storms today in the flooded areas of Berkshire and Surrey, but tomorrow it's going to get bad again. Tonight, warnings of a danger to life are still in place, but it's emerged that when it comes to avoiding similar problems in the future, the Environment Agency has already had plans drawn up. They just lack the money to do anything about them. Here's our political correspondent, Carl Mercer.
They're scenes that are becoming all too familiar. The Army last night in Chertsey setting up temporary flood defences to try and hold back the Thames. And this afternoon, more familiar scenes and more familiar frustration from people who feel their communities have been let down.
You read with the comments of the politicians and it's like they're saying stuff that they're not answering questions, that they're not giving us answers. So I think majority of people just feel that the money isn't spent the way it should be spent.
I mean, we know it's going to happen here, so if they can do something in Holland, well, why can't they do it here? We've got money being spent on things that it doesn't need to be. Spend it where it matters.
But roll back the clock 11 years and this was the scene in the area. The floods back then, not as bad as the current crop. 250 homes were flooded in 2003. But the devastation then prompted plans to save the area from future damage of the type we've seen over the past few days. Those plans ended up with this report from the Environment Agency from August 2010. It's a 20-year vision for the Lower Thames area, which includes places like Wraysbury, Datchet, Egham and Staines. And it's fairly blunt in its assessment of the need for action. It said the area covers one of the largest and most at-risk developed but undefended floodplains in England, with 21,000 properties and 50,000 people at risk of flooding. It's a bold plan. It would see 3 big new flood channels dug, each up to 60 metres wide and stretching a total of more than 10 miles. It wouldn't be complete, though, until 2026. But there's a bigger hurdle. At the moment, the Environment Agency doesn't have the money to pay for it.
At the point at which the study was stopped, it was agreed that this was needed for this particular area of London, and investments would have been made towards that. Unfortunately, investment in the project stopped about 3 years ago. We've reduced funding across a number of projects in the Environment Agency.
The project will cost £256 million, but government is only stumping up £136 million. The Environment Agency needs to raise £120 million.
I'm hopeful that this sort of event will have focused people's minds so that the potential partners, local authorities and so on, landowners along the river, will want to join with us and provide funding as well so that this project can go ahead, because they'll see the economic benefits for themselves.
So while locals are hoping for government money to help them, the Environment Agency is having to cast its net a little further afield. Carl Mercer, BBC London News.
Well, let's speak to our reporter Nick Beake, who spent today in Staines upon Thames. And Nick, the government has said money's no object when it comes to the floods. Is that good news for this project and stopping future floods where you are, for instance?
Well, Asad, I think the short answer is probably no. That's because the Prime Minister's comments have been interpreted as concerning the short-term clear-up operation rather than any longer-term big projects. The Prime Minister did chair today this Cabinet committee, and it was announced afterwards that there would be a review of compensation for the victims of flooding and also a review of future flood defences. But in terms of this particular scheme for the Lower Thames, the position we find ourselves in is that another £120 million is needed from local authorities to make it a reality. And if indeed that money is gathered, it won't be until 2026 that this scheme would be finished. So in the here and now, if you've been flooded in Staines, Surrey or beyond, little consolation. And we've been talking to the local GP here. He's actually set up his surgery in this pub because his practice down the road has been flooded, and he told us that he has already treated people for the psychological impact of the flooding.
They've had their lifetime sort of ruined, really, because of the emotional upset. So I've seen patients with what you call flood stress, and they're in a state of shock, denial and anxiety. So we're treating them in terms of medication and counselling.
And Nick, I understand tonight there are warnings for people in Surrey and Berkshire when it comes to floodwater.
That's right, Asad. This has come from public health officials. They're concerned about the water, specifically the bugs that might be in there. So the likes of E. coli, salmonella, which can cause fever, stomach pains and diarrhoea too. They're worried that sewage might escape and also combine possibly with animal waste. Another concern would be that the winter vomiting virus, the norovirus, and maybe even hepatitis A could spread more easily because of this dirty water. Now, the best advice really we're being given is to wash our hands thoroughly. It's pretty obvious advice. Keep pets away from the water. They're at pains to point out that it's not just through coming into contact with this particular water that you could become ill, it's through ingesting it. So that is why they've issued this advice. At the moment, Assad, today the water levels have receded somewhat with the prospects of more rain tomorrow. They're likely to rise once more.
OK, Nick Beakin, Staines upon Thames, thanks very much, and we will be getting the weather forecast in just a moment. But first, in other news.